Hi, I'm Jim Baccarosa, and welcome to Aviation Tech Talks. In this podcast series, we'll be speaking with industry experts and pioneers, delving deep into the latest developments and advancements in aviation tech. From futuristic aircraft designs to cutting-edge digital solutions, we'll be exploring how technology is shaping the future of the industry. So buckle up and join us for an exciting ride as we take off into the fascinating world of aviation tech. All right, welcome everybody to Aviation Tech Talks, where innovation takes flight. This week on our newest edition here, I have the pleasure of welcoming David Bettenhausen, the founder and CEO of Aerotrax. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
It's great. We got a chance to meet, a few years ago. We were both on a panel discussing digitization in the supply chain, and I think you and I had a lot of common opinions on digitization in this industry, and we just became kindred souls over many dinners and drinks since then. So it's a pleasure to have you on, and we're looking forward to the discussion today. So I would like to share with some of the folks here that are tuning in today a little bit about your background and kind of where you came from here. So for everybody on the call today here listening in, David Bettenhausen is the founder and CEO of Aerotrax Technologies. It's an enterprise software company enabling greater efficiency in the aviation and aerospace supply chain. Launched out of his Villanova University dorm room in 2019, Aerotrax has gone on to win numerous industry awards, secure leading-edge customers across the aviation aftermarket, and attract world-class investors and employees. Before founding Aerotrax in July of 2019, David was an entrepreneur in residence at R3, where he had laid the groundwork for his current venture. His previous projects as a freelance consultant centered around data integration, algorithmic risk modeling, and network infrastructure design with clients that spanned insurance, financial services, and telecommunication. David holds a bachelor's degree in finance and business analytics from Villanova University. His achievements in the aviation industry and beyond have earned him recognition across major outlets like The Economist, TechCrunch, Aviation Week Network, as well as industry conference panels and podcasts. So, David, welcome. Did I miss anything there?
No, you did not. Thank you for such a kind introduction here, Jim.
Well, I think it doesn't even do justice to some of the very interesting things I've seen, So before we get started, I want to share with somebody something that I thought was pretty amazing, especially for an early stage startup. And that is somehow, along with companies like McDonald's or Disney, in Times Square, somehow there was a featured on giant LED screens Aerotrax. Tell us about that, and what was that experience about?
Totally. Yeah, and I actually have not really gotten a chance to talk about this much as far as like what led to it, but kind of the background. We were having a little brainstorming session on marketing and go-to-market with our team. And in these sessions, we like to put stuff down on whiteboards, as you do. And I remember putting on the whiteboard, Air Carriers Purchasing Conference, Times Square billboard. And everyone goes, that's ridiculous. As a startup, you have very limited resources, right? From, people constraints to dollar constraints to time constraints. You're always fighting against these constraints. A lot of times budget being a major one. And so a billboard Times Square, which runs you, $250,000, was never really in the picture. But through a couple cold outreach emails at the right time and some really great people along the way, we were able to secure 2 Times Square billboards right across the street from where Air Carriers Purchasing Conference was held back in August in New York for a 10-second spot every single hour, 24 hours a day for a full week. And so we were really fortunate. Yeah, it was a really cool moment. We had over 50 people come out for what I called the billboard drop party. And it was a ton of fun. And really, really special moment for us and the company and the whole team, really, to see our work come through on such a big stage.
Well, congratulations. I thought that was one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen out of a small startup company, to be up on a giant screen in Times Square during ACPC. It was pretty cool. I remember messaging you off to the side, like, how did you do this? This is pretty.
Yeah. And I think I said a story for another day, right? And here we are.
Right. I mean, it was just really incredible. And I think that's another thing we had in common. One of my very first startups, we worked with a company, Philips, who put the light bulbs in when it used to be light bulbs in the ball that dropped at Times Square. And now it's since switched over to LEDs. But on the very last time it was ever dropped with light bulbs, we auctioned off for charity each one of those individual bulbs. And Philips gave us one. So we have one of the last light bulbs in Times Square at the ball drop. So we have way more in common than you realize. So even that. So another thing before we get started that I thought was pretty impressive, that when we start talking about innovation. So here's an innovative way you got your company in Times Square. You recently were featured in The Economist in their Innovation Quotient report. How did that happen? Or, what were some of the things that you could share with some of the listeners today about what you're discussing there with The Economist, especially when it relates to innovation in the aviation sector?
Totally. Yeah. And honestly, I don't really know how it happened, but somebody reached out to me from The Economist and asked for my perspective on how innovation is sort of being incubated across different geographies, and aviation being such a global industry. I was able to provide a perspective that not only looked at sort of our pocket of Dallas, Texas, or New York City, where I've spent most of my time, but also looking at sort of the global spectrum. Where, I've been to Paris Air Show, had conversations in the startup world, as well as aviation world, as well as London and some of these other places. And so, I think one of the major takeaways is this idea of how new ideas can turn into larger businesses that then employ people and grow the economy, right? And so I think this idea of a business being a profit generating sort of entity is one concept, but the other piece of it to look at is, it provides jobs for people, right? It's a way to create value, not just for, the founding group, but also the shareholders, as well as the employees, as well as the end customers, right? You're not going to get paid to do something unless you're helping to solve a real problem. And so, I think the core conversation around the innovation quotient was really trying to find a benchmark of how these different hubs of localities across the world were fostering this sort of innovative culture. And so, there's a number of ways to do that through policy, as well as through different various, forums. And so, it was really providing that sort of broad spectrum of how to grow different companies to then grow economies.
So you're really our spokesperson for the aviation technology industry in The Economist and how we can make it grow. You should get a new hat, I think, for that.
Yeah, maybe. But, this hat has seen many days.
That's right. That's great. No, I mean, I think a lot of the industry has gotten a bad rep with all of the things in the media, but there's a ton of folks in this space that are really trying to improve upon that. And our topic today, you and I had gone back and forth a few times about, we really kind of landed on, when we want to talk about innovation in the aviation industry, a lot of the focus has been on airlines or Boeing or defense or the consumer. But we really landed today, what we want to spend some time discussing are things that in the aviation aftermarket. So talk about shifts in the aviation aftermarket technology, right? And how did you come from, your dorm room to building something that is in the aftermarket space. And how was that innovation, and what drove you to that? What was your journey to that area of the market?
Really good question. I think it kind of stems back from our days before we even founded the company. One of the really glaring insights we saw through a report that may have been published by Honeywell actually back in the day when they were launching one of their blockchain products is this idea that less than 2% of transactions that happen in the aftermarket are occurring online. And, I'll define sort of the aftermarket as the area where aircraft parts are bought and sold. And so that could be spare parts as well as used serviceable material. And then also some maintenance, repair, and overhaul activities. So keeping, whether it's a part or a plane or an engine up to standard so it's safe to fly. And so, having that sort of broad level idea that less than 2% of transactions are happening online, our sort of core underlying thesis is that number would grow exponentially within a short period of time. There's a marketplace for pretty much anything. I can rent out my couch and have somebody sleep on it if I really wanted to, right? And so I think it was this, you can call it naivete if you want, you can call it confidence if you want, but like a mixture of these ideas that we could actually drive positive change to bring this industry into sort of the digital era. We have iterated many times in that. So the initial concept was a marketplace for aircraft parts. What we found out, though, is that part of the reason that a marketplace doesn't exist is because the documentation that goes along with these parts is so key. And so as we've seen sort of this push towards digitalization happen, we look at companies like ProvenAir that help not only digitize the documents and take what's stuck inside of PDFs and make them readable, but help kind of create these sort of back to birth historical reports around these parts. And so that's a layer to this sort of broader shift in the aviation aftermarket technology. Then where we saw an opportunity on top of that is looking at sort of the operational metrics that drive a business, and trying to unpack that and find ways to define levers of the business to then grow the business in an efficient way. And so an example of that could be, looking at a maintenance, repair, and overhaul shop, that largely has revenue driven by manpower and materials. And so what is really important as a metric in that business is what we call backlog velocity. So how quickly are you moving items that show up at your doorstep through, the chain of repair, in the queue that it has, allocating resources properly, recording all of these activities properly, and then understanding where there's room for improvement, and then driving the positive change to make those improvements incrementally to drive, sort of a larger strategic goal of growing the business profitably. That in the end is where we ended up focusing on is how can we allow these companies to be more operationally efficient. So there's lots of room for growth. I don't think we've moved the needle on that, percentage of transactions happening online yet. I think there's still a lot of room for improvement. And so, maybe we can talk about shifts in aviation aftermarket technology or lack thereof,
Yeah, right.
So that's, it's interesting.
Yeah. And I 100% agree with you. I come from the digital world throughout my entire career. My wife's the one who got me into this industry. Yep. And that was one of the first things I thought of. And I actually came from e-commerce, right? Yes. My first startup company was in the e-commerce world where, we sold everything online. And when I found out my wife was selling high dollar value aircraft parts in a phone to phone, or at the time, fax to fax sort of environment, I thought, this is crazy. So I initially thought that as well, where it was a perfect opportunity to move this unambiguous part. Part number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is part number 1, 2, 3, 5. Move it to the internet and help make the transactions much more efficient, scalable, higher quality, yet a lot of pushback in the aftermarket, a lot. And we could have a whole discussion around that. But and since then, I've been watching the industry. Obviously, I believe in paperwork was an issue, but I think it's even more than that. I've talked to other folks who are building giant web stores to sell that material online. Simple thing like a web store, right? You would think that you could rent your couch or sell a mouse or anything you can buy on Amazon, right? Except now when a major supplier puts their own owned material on their website, they can't get their customers to buy it. They had to give out 10% discount. Click on this link. Go to the web store, put it in your cart. And they wouldn't do it. Had that conversation. So, we see a lot of challenges, right? But I see when there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of opportunities. So kind of in that vein, if we look at the aviation aftermarket technology challenge and opportunity, where do you see some opportunities that you think there'll be some adoption of in the future?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, there's so many parts of our story that are connected, I think, between the two of us, even though we had sort of opposite ways of coming into this space, where we have similar sort of core underlying theses around where it's going and the direction it's going. So this is definitely a fun conversation to have. But I think for the overall opportunities, it's, in my mind right now, there are so many. So the question becomes, what's the low-hanging fruit, right? Where can we target today to get sort of the most value in the beginning? Because I think there's a lot of what I would call software fatigue in the market, where there's been so many failed IT projects for various reasons. Maybe the technology just didn't work to start. Maybe it didn't have the right executive leadership buy-in. Maybe the team that was staffed to execute the implementation didn't have the right skill set, right? So there's many reasons why things have failed in the past. And so I think there's a lot of this sort of scar tissue built up in this market around software. And so there's this extra level of inertia that we as software providers have to overcome. And, as far as opportunities go in understanding that, I see a really strong sort of opportunity to really drive change from inside out, where businesses make key leadership hires in the technology space, in the information side, in the data side, in software engineering, to build a competitive advantage for their own business. And so I kind of see this pendulum swinging in the direction of, okay, you have these massive ERP providers that all have built these pieces of software that work, but only work if built across with many different consultants, right? And so the pendulum, I think, is swinging to in-house software engineering teams building systems internally to drive operating leverage for aftermarket businesses. And so, it always starts with the business problem. Like you said, there's many challenges to overcome. So where can we find an opportunity area? And I think that as we go forward, artificial intelligence, which is obviously a hot topic for very good reasons, I think it's here to stay. And what that can do for a business from, the data ingestion piece. So being able to take tons of data, ingesting it into a usable format, and then being able to build dashboards or operating models based on, all the way to, reading what's actually in a document, and being able to search it. So providing sort of enterprise search capabilities, because there is so much, I guess it goes back to this idea that aviation, I think more broadly is very data rich, but, action poor, if you will. And so I think there is this gap of data to action that needs to be closed. And that's really where the opportunity is. So different technologies that can come to market. Yes, AI, cloud, but I think it's really going to be about the people, these companies bring in that will drive that change, because it really does come down to people more than the technology itself, in my mind.
Yeah. And I think that's a great segue probably to our next kind of question or discussion here, is that, how do you take, if you look at your own culture in your organization of, hey, how do we make things better? How do we innovate? And obviously it's surrounding technology, right? I'm a big believer, and I think you are too, that the culture is what drives the entire organization. And you mentioned, hey, they're bringing in different people. Is that going to affect the culture? And how how should someone let's rephrase that. How do you see companies in the aviation aftermarket changing their culture so that they can embrace this technology, right? Like, how do you do it?
It's a good question. I definitely don't have the silver bullet answer to it. I think what becomes interesting, though, is if you're able to kind of put it into the context of aviation, right? And so one way to think of this is because there has been sort of this, I want to say, affliction or a push away from technology to begin with. There's been lower investment dollars that have been allocated to software R&D type projects in this space, and really innovative projects that drive transformative change, not just incremental change, but the type of change that gives you a sustainable competitive advantage. And so I think one piece of that equation is definitely budgeting and dollars. How you allocate that and where you spend those dollars is kind of the stamp of approval of how innovative your culture is, right? If you say you're a company that's very innovative and you spend a grand total of less than 1% of your entire spend on R&D, I think there's a mismatch in actions versus words. And so that's definitely part of the equation. I think putting it into aviation context, though, it's like, if you do have that lack of budget going towards technology and R&D, then, you're not really maintaining your internal operating systems, right? The maintenance required, you're not really filling that bank that is needed in order to grow the business. And so ultimately, you're going to have to pay a hefty price in an overhaul, if you will, down the road because you're not maintaining it properly. And so I think that's kind of a good way to think about it from a leadership standpoint. But ultimately, yeah, it really comes down to empowering your people to be able to look at a problem that comes onto their plate and say, how can I solve this? Do I buy something? Do I build it myself? I shouldn't continue to ignore it. It's really empowering them to solve the problems themselves.
Yeah. And I think you touched on a couple of things, right? Leadership, budget, large organizations, the common belief. In fact, I had a guest on the show says, big companies are really good at making incremental changes, but they're not good at making step changes, right? Like that's your classic innovator's dilemma, right? So that it takes a startup company to make that step change, but it also requires support from the larger organizations, right? So when you look at those kind of things in the market, what kind of trends are you seeing then, if we put it in the aviation aftermarket context of larger organizations either investing in internal projects, supporting a step change? How is leadership getting involved there? How do you see the culture of these organizations, adopting it, really? Maybe talk about that and what you're seeing in the market.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I, again, don't have the silver bullet answer to it. I think for now, what I'm seeing is it coming down to sort of the fundamental question: do we build that culture or do we buy it out and try to embed it, right? And so it like what I'm seeing is this trend towards mergers and acquisitions, where larger companies are going to be looking at smaller, more nimble, more agile companies that have innovation at sort of the center of their business, to bring them in and have, that type of mindset, that startup mentality, that every dollar is, has to be spent exactly the right way, and that you have to invest, in the internal systems to give the business operating leverage. It's starting to see that, embed that in the culture, to then have it grow through osmosis throughout the rest of the larger organization. I think it is tough for large organizations to drive sort of step change in culture, in operating philosophy without any changes, right? It's nothing changes if nothing changes. It's like this fundamental it's your core thing. You can't expect things to change without actually doing something. And I think, unfortunately, we've been over the last 5-10 years in aviation, there have been so many problems that have hit the market, from COVID-19, MAX disruptions, to now, engine issues. And so I think these, like all of these things coming together have all distracted a lot of key leaders from making the step changes and the step change investments required to give their businesses sustainable competitive advantages. And so I think what we'll see sort of in this next phase is a lot of mergers and acquisitions in order to, create that sort of culture of change and positive growth inside these businesses.
I agree. I see a lot of M&A activity out there, especially in the parts world or the MRO world. Yep. Not so much around the technology world, but I hadn't thought of it as, hey, this is injecting a new innovative culture into a business. So that's a great take on how companies can go about doing that. And then you also mentioned there were a bunch of disruptions in the industry, but I think that happens all the time, right? There's always going to be something that will require some attention from leadership, right? But how would you say, and you could use your own, Aerotrax as an example, and we're talking about AI and all these different trends, but how do you then stay up on the technology, given that it's shifting so fast in the market, and there's always a problem that's going to need your attention, right? So how do you stay or keep your culture, let's do that, focused on, or at least making the technology, the trends? How do you stay up on it? How do you make that a priority, or with everything else that's competing for your attention?
Definitely. I'd say it's an artful and delicate balance, right, of sort of very long-term strategic thinking and execution to the day-to-day operations. There's a large gap between a decade and a day, right? And what matters, though, is having sort of the context of where you want to be a decade from now, and making sure that everything you're doing today aligns with that sort of end state. And so for us, we always painted that picture of an end state of being able to digitally track the life cycle of every single part, every single aircraft, every single component in the air and on the ground. And it's been a good North Star. And I think for us, it's like, okay, what are some creative ways we can start to get some of this information that then becomes actionable to then be able to track more and more parts throughout the supply chain? And so that's one way to think about it. I think for us, we're a much smaller team, so it's easier to pivot and to realign. I think this concept of alignment is so critical in any business. If you don't have people that are very talented moving in the same direction at the same time, they're not going to be able to accomplish what you set out to accomplish. And so as, maybe a larger business or an aviation aftermarket business, I think the first piece of all of this is what I would call doing an inventory, right? Is like, what do we have? Who's on the team? And then finding the gaps. It's like a gap analysis. And then trying to align the business to have that North Star and to go forward and charge to it. And that North Star could be a revenue number. It could be sort of an operating metric. It could be a customer service metric. Who knows? And so it just depends on what the business really wants to have. And so for us, as we've looked to grow our presence in this industry, that alignment piece has been key, and being able to empower all of our people to make decisions where they are best suited to make decisions, whether that be technology or that be operations. I'm not a technologist, so I'm not going to be the one making technology decisions, right? And so I'll let our chief technology officer make those decisions. And so I think that empowerment piece is the key to unlocking greater sort of efficiency for the business going forward, all the while staying aligned.
That's great. And I think it stems from the CEO pointing out the roadmap. What's your North Star? Empowering the team and saying technology is going to be a focus for us. So tell us a little bit about Aerotrax, what you're up to now. You mentioned some pivots. Anything exciting you can share?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for bringing it up. I think this is part of sort of, a lot of the pieces I was talking about in this discussion have been centered around, the people plus technology. And I think we've really come to the conclusion in our business that it's hard to build software for everybody, right? It's much easier to drive change when you build a proprietary system that solves a problem for a single customer. And so we're actually taking that idea and running with it a bit deeper to say, look, we're no longer going to be selling our software as a service to everybody. We're really only looking for one business to work with in a long-term way to build proprietary systems internally with them, connect some dots, and drive a sustainable competitive advantage for that business, right? And so what that does is it not only allows the company to unlock sort of revenue efficiency, but if implemented properly from a digital side, could drive EBITDA multiple expansion for the business as well. And so it's an interesting time for us because we've kind of had this aha moment. And it goes back to kind of in the early 2000s, late 90s, there was a consulting company called the Feld Group that did this with many of the largest airlines that we have around today, between Delta, Southwest, even FedEx, where they would come in with a C-suite team for hire, and they drive sort of a roadmap of business and IT to connect the dots and align the business to drive, a really step change in growth from providing that operating leverage of information technology. And so we see a sort of similar point in time today where you have all of these new technology advancements that have happened in the last 10 years, even the last 2 years. And, aviation is still probably a couple decades behind on that side. And so we're in our mind saying, if we do want to drive change, which is fundamentally what we want to do as a company, let's drive positive change and still track as many parts as we possibly can, then what we should do is try to embed our core team into sort of the management or the leadership of a larger organization that has sort of the power to move markets and help them get better so that they can help the rest of sort of the supply chain around them get better as well. And so that's our core large strategy shift that we're doing. And so working with a couple of businesses right now to outline that scope, and then we'll kind of have someone figured out in the next couple of weeks. So that's it.
Well, that's awesome.
What about you, Jim?
What about me? Well, I'm hosting podcasts now, right? So,
yeah.
I think a lot of people have been following our story, over at ProvenAir, and we brought on a lot of bigger entities onto the platform to try to optimize the way transactions are getting done in the aftermarket, right? I mean, I think my story of being completely frustrated with buying and selling material in the space and having to make it better. And so, we've had significant growth lately. So it's pretty exciting. So I think maybe 2024 is the year that the aviation industry starts the culture shift in accepting technology, and that it's actually going to drive their businesses. I think that's starting to happen. We're really seeing it. I think the new wave of folks are coming in. The old guard is retiring. They're much more embracing the culture of we need software. We need technology. We need innovation. We can't keep doing it the way we are. So that's been great. Anything else you want to share with our viewers today? Any shifts that you're seeing? Anything else so we can leave them with today? And I don't want to put you on the spot, right? Because I'm guessing you probably want to talk about soccer, right? But...
Yeah, I can always talk your ear off about soccer. What the rest of the world would call football, But I guess I'll just kind of highlight that one of the notes I said is like nothing changes if nothing changes. I think having conversations is really great. And I start to see more and more companies come out with really strong press releases about all these AI and digital things that they're doing. But, without actually bringing in technology leaders, perhaps from even outside the industry, that provides sort of a blank canvas view of how to solve some of these decades-old problems, I don't think we're actually going to drive any meaningful change. And so nothing changes if nothing changes, and let's actually start to drive some positive change for this industry.
But I think we're seeing it. So I think we are going to start seeing some changes, which I like. So So,
Yep.
Dave, how does somebody get a hold of you? How do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, great question. The easiest way is fill out a contact form, aerotrax.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn. David Bettenhausen is my name. And so you can look me up on LinkedIn or reach out to aerotrax.com. Always open. Yeah, happy to have a conversation, follow up with anyone that's interested.
Great. Well, thanks, Dave, for being on the show today. Very great perspective on what's going on out in the market, and hopefully everybody found it very interesting conversation today. Anyway, we'll wrap it up here. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and please join us for our next Aviation Tech Talk, where innovation takes flight. Thanks, everybody.